Okay, we are now recording. And we will have a Q&A at the end of Joanne's talk. We talked a little bit about how to best do that. And because there are so many people, I think that it would be best if we just enter our questions through the chat feature. So down, if you have a desktop, you'll see chat in the lower bar at the bottom of your screen. And if you're using an iPad, you will just tap for the control bar, you tap on participants, and at the bottom of the list, you tap chat, and then you type your message and hit send. And Joanne, you don't have to worry. I will be reading those messages out and helping to handle that.
Thank you.
So that, I think, is it for the housekeeping. I don't know if you can hear the lawn being mowed in the background here. I apologize for that. But I would like to start tonight by acknowledging that this is a timely conversation that we're having. Any conversation about slavery is obviously also a conversation about race, and the history that we'll be learning about tonight is still very much with us. The events of the past couple of weeks and the anger and the frustration that have been demonstrated by the protests around the country point to the fact that America is clearly not done dealing with the legacy of slavery and the racist ideas that were used to justify it. So with that said, we're hoping that this Illuminating History project is just one small step to learn about our history of slavery in this area where we live. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project. Many of you have participated all along from the very beginning, but just in case you haven't, this project was a collaboration between the local artist Ana Flores and the Charlestown Historical Society, represented by Pam Lyons tonight, and the Cross Mills Public Library. We envisioned a multi-part program which would shed light on this somewhat hidden history of slavery in our area. And this program was designed to have 4 parts. So there's an exhibit, which is in the library. And of course, no one's been able to see it for the past couple of months, but it is still here, and we will be keeping it up through the end of June. And the library will be opening to limited numbers on Monday. So I would like to invite you to come and see the exhibit, which includes some artifacts pertaining to slavery in this area from the collection of the Charlestown Historical Society. And we also have an art installation by Ana Flores that addresses this history that's also on display at the library. And then the other part of this project was this series of special events. And those of you who attended the first couple of events know how overwhelming the turnout was. It was much higher than expected, at least for me. We had standing room only at the first 2 events. It was just really fabulous to see how people wanted to come out and learn about this history. First, we started with a screening of the documentary Traces of the Trade, which is about Katrina Brown. The filmmaker is a member of the DeWolf family, and she and 9 other family members. The DeWolf family is one of the largest slave trading families in US history, and they traced together the triangle trade route and also had many conversations about their family legacy and about the Black and white divide. Then we had Dr. Charlotte Carrington Farmer, who is participating. She's here as a participant tonight, she is a professor at Roger Williams University, and she spoke on South County's plantation economy and how it was tied to the sugar industry and relied on enslaved workers. We have our special guest tonight, Dr. Joanne Melish, speaking on slavery and memory in the making of New England history. And we will finish up with James Glickman, who is also a participant tonight, who will join us on June 25th to speak about the first Rhode Island all-Black regiment in the American Revolution. And then the last part of this project is going to be a printed booklet with photographs of the exhibits and summaries of the events, as well as, we hope, reactions from the participants. And this part is being funded through a grant from the Rhode Island Foundation. And Anna, did you just want to say a couple words about that, or?
Yes, hello. First of all, it's a real pleasure to see so many people on, and thank you again to Joanne for doing this for us. Yes, we're very lucky to be able to compile these extraordinary events that have happened here, but we very much want this other component of the public reaction to be an element in this small book that we produce. So I encourage people who begin to have discussions and dialogues at home or with others, and also maybe think of plans of action they might want to take in the community. Any kind of rustling that all of this information does for you as a citizen, for yourself individually. If you want to reach out to me and have a dialogue, there might be a way to include this in our final chapter of this little book of how this has settled with the community and what it's caused. So I think that's very important, especially at this time. Thank you.
And now Pam Lyons is going to introduce Dr. Joanne Pope Melish.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Anna, too. Tonight, you will very much enjoy this presentation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Dr. Melish's accolades. Joanne Pope Melish is an associate professor of history emerita at the University of Kentucky, where she also directed the American Studies program and co-directed the Africana Studies Initiative for several years. Dr. Melish received her BA, MA, and PhD in American Civilization from Brown University. She is the author of Disowning Slavery, Gradual Emancipation and Race in New England, 1780 to 1860. And many essays on race and slavery in the early republic and on slavery in public history. She has directed or co-directed several National Endowment for the Humanities funded residential summer teacher institutes and workshops on race and slavery in early New England. She has also served as a consultant to several historic sites, and currently Dr. Melish is a visiting scholar in the American Studies Department at Brown University. I'm very pleased to introduce to you, all of you, our presenter this evening, Dr. Joanne Pope Melish.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pam. Thank you all for participating in this. This is the first time I give a lot of talks, and this is the first one I've ever done in this way. So bear with me. I want to thank the Illuminating History Project, Cross Mills Public Library, the Charlestown Historical Society, and Earth Informed Studio for inviting me to participate in this terrific series of programs. I snuck into the last one, Charlotte. I was there and really enjoyed it. That was almost 3 months ago, almost to the day, when Charlotte Carrington Farmer explored Rhode Island slavery, and particularly plantation slavery, through the lens of the Ernest Hamlin Baker mural, originally painted in 1936 under the auspices of the Public Buildings Administration of the Federal Works Agency. It was installed in 1940 in the Wakefield Post Office. I bring that up for two reasons. First of all, the mural is now in South County History Center in the old jail in Kingston. And I'm chair of that board, are preparing an exhibit that includes the original sketches for the mural, very different from the final mural. And when we mount it and we can all go out again, I encourage you to come and take a look. And I very much enjoyed Charlotte's way of using the mural to explore Rhode Island slavery. My original task today here was to talk about how slavery in Rhode Island and New England ended, and how this triumphal story of a region, and more specifically the state of Rhode Island, was built on the backs of great white men, and that history was obscured. And I will do that, but the first two parts of this project were 3 months ago and more. And so if you don't mind, I would like to talk first very briefly in very general terms about Rhode Island's involvement in the slave trade and slavery, and then focus on the end of slavery here. My specific expertise and interest is in the way in which, the very peculiar way in which slavery ended in Rhode Island and the North in general had a devastating and permanent, I think, well, I hope not, but permanent so far, effect on racial thinking and white entitlement, linking three ideas: emancipation, Black freedom, and race, in ways that have legacies today. So very quickly, the story of the New England slave trade, you'll remember, begins with indigenous people. First, the Pequot War of 1637, and later King Philip's War in 1676, brought indigenous captives into English hands. The English distributed the captive native women and children among English households and sent most of the male captives to work as slaves in the Sugar Islands of the West Indies. I would remind you that the life expectancy of a enslaved sugar worker in the West Indies was 5 to 7 years. So that in and of itself is a brutal element of this history. In the course of King Philip's War alone, more than 2,000 Wampanoag, Narragansett, and other indigenous captives were reduced to servitude. Meanwhile, the importation of captive Africans had begun in 1638, when 17 Pequot captives were exchanged at Providence Island in the West Indies for, quote, some cotton and tobacco and Negroes. Bodies exchanged for bodies. Quickly, however, the enslaved Africans became the steady, continuing source of labor. So, in general terms, overall, about 12.5 million captive Africans were taken out of Africa on slave ships bound for the Americas. Slave ships coming from a host of slaving nations: England, Spain, France, Holland, Denmark, Portugal. About 11.5 million of them survived the Middle Passage and were disembarked in the Americas. Now, of that trade, North American boats made about 2,000 of those slaving voyages, and those carried about 250,000 captives, and half of those voyages, about 1,000, were made in Rhode Island boats. Rhode Island boats carried at least 106,000 captive Africans. So first, I want to just not a side issue, but this is something that most people don't realize. Look at this. This is the chart of estimated immigration to the whole 13 colonies from 1607, that's Jamestown, to 1775, eve of the Revolution. And you will notice that if you look at these numbers, two, I think, very interesting points people don't realize. 40% of the immigration to the American 13 colonies was African, 40% of it. And also notice, if you look at African slaves, convicts and prisoners, and indentured servants, free immigrants, the people our history books focus on, the people we extol as having created the city on a hill. That's 28% of the immigration, a little more than a quarter of that immigration. I think that is an interesting point to keep in mind. And leads to the question, who built this country? Not free white people entirely, or even substantially. Let's now look at the enslaved African immigration to North America. Okay, notice I'm comparing here the estimated number of captives directly from Africa, and then many captives come from Africa are what the term used to be a terrible term, seasoned in the West Indies, and then brought to North America. So we have the overall number coming to North America and in blue, and the numbers coming to New England in red. Okay, so directly from Africa, about 10,000 people. From the Caribbean to New England, another almost 4,000. So the total number that came to North America is almost 500,000, and the total, of that, the total number that came to New England is about 13 and a half, close to 14,000 people. It gives you an idea of the size of this immigration. Here's a classic, I think Charlotte used this too, but I'm not sure. Notice of enslaved people, well, captive Africans who have come into Newport and who are for sale, Gold Coast slaves. There were many of these notices, and also many agreements ahead of time made with captains to bring back 2 or 3 with particular qualities that individuals here in Rhode Island wanted as enslaved people. This is, actually, did I lose? No, I didn't. Here's a series of 3 graphs. My friend Peter Fay created the graphs. I'm not graphically talented any more than I am technologically talented. Showing the population growth and where, can you read those numbers, where in Rhode Island these people went. Initially, I don't have a graph for this. Let me see. The first colony census was in 1708, and I don't have a graph for that. But they were already 1708. Africans were about 6% of the population. It's a small population, but nonetheless. Here is the enslaved population of Rhode Island in 1748. There are about 2,000 enslaved people among 28,400 whites, about 6.8%. And you can see the cities and towns. Look at Charlestown. Look at South Kingstown, the agricultural part of the state. Look at Newport, which is of course the entrepot that many of the, before the revolution, slaving, it's the center of the slave trade. After the revolution, it's Bristol. So there's that population, okay. By 1755, and this is a graph that breaks, the censuses are inconsistent. Sometimes they break down by gender, sometimes they don't. They call, sometimes they say enslaved people, sometimes they say Negroes, and as time goes on, more and more of those Negroes are free. So it isn't entirely comparative. But here in 1748, you've got about 6.8%. See that every single city and town now, then a smaller number of towns than we have now, every city and town in Rhode Island had enslaved people living there. About 22% of them in Newport, Bristol, and Providence. 33% of them, a third of them, are in the so-called Narragansett country, working in the provisioning trades to the West Indies. And then the distribution of mostly enslaved people, let's see, that was 1755. I'm sorry, I was getting ahead of myself here. In 55, they're about between 10 and 11%. That's the peak of enslavement in Rhode Island. The previous things I said, a third in Narragansett, go with the 1748. Now we're in 1755. It's the peak. You've got about a quarter in the Narragansett country, about a third in the port cities. And at this point, only 5 out of 25 cities and towns had fewer than 50 enslaved laborers. So this is not something that, well, it's the coast, well, it's agriculture. Every city and town has enslaved people in fairly, I would say, large numbers. And then by 1774, again, this is a census that distinguishes Indians and blacks, but not enslaved and free, okay? But again, there's a distribution. Many of these people are enslaved people. Notice the blue, those are native people, indigenous people, and the red parts of the bars in the graph are African. Now, just really quickly, here's a comparative chart of enslavement, the numbers moving through time from 1700 to 1790, which of course is the first federal census. The numbers comparing Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. You'll see there that the peak in Rhode Island is in 1755. It's later in 1774 in Connecticut and in Massachusetts. And again, these numbers, the percentage of enslaved people elsewhere, Rhode Island is by far the highest in New England, partly because it is the center of the slave trade. And there's a familiarity with and demand for enslaved people there, but they are everywhere. Very quickly, who owned enslaved people? Everyone at all levels, from clergy and merchants to major landowners to ordinary artisans and farmers owned slaves. This is not long ago. The argument was, well, it's only elite rich people. It's not that rich people own slaves, it's that enslaved people made men rich. And if you look at wills and probates, rich men have slaves. If you look at diaries and journals, artisans and people on the way up, so to speak, have enslaved people that get them to the point where as old men they die with many slaves. Now, you can't, can you see? Yeah, you can, I guess. I know that faces are obscuring the far side of this, but I thought you would be interested in the largest land holdings in Narragansett country. These are land holdings that, from their owner's point of view, require large numbers of enslaved laborers. And you can see Charlestown, the largest of the bunch is Joseph Stanton in Charlestown with 5,760 acres. Also Charlestown, Christopher Champlin. There are others, but these are the largest of the landowners. I think that's interesting from the point of view of this project. So, and of course, here's a piece of the Baker mural depicting all the economic activities of the planters as Charlotte so beautifully analyzed. So, either through employment of enslaved labor or involvement in trading enslaved laborers or financing the trade or supplying the trade or supplying the plantations that in turn used enslaved laborers. Slavery was the engine, I would argue, of the Rhode Island maritime commercial economy and one of the engines of economies throughout coastal New England. So if that's true, why does it end? Now we come to what is supposed to be my part of this project. This is I think, at least as troubling a story as the story of enslavement itself. So, quickly moving toward emancipation. Among whites, the emancipation movement involved a very slowly, and much resisted criticism of slavery. You all heard about the importance of the Society of Friends, Quakers. And they are instrumental, yes, in beginning to attack the morality, first of the trade and then later of enslavement itself. They separate those two ideas. The trade in humans is their first moral problem, and then they address the problem of enslavement itself. In Rhode Island, around 1769, the Quakers begin proposing manumitting enslaved people and begin to form visiting committees to try to persuade recalcitrant Quakers, because there are three kinds of Quakers. Quakers who get it and free their slaves, and many Quakers who left the Society of Friends rather than release their slaves. And then there's the third kind, who offered the 1,000 reasons why not yet, but would someday, and kept asking the society not to be hasty about it. And there are countless reports of Quaker visiting committees going and arguing with people about, but why not now? And you hear, oh, because. And manumission didn't always spell freedom for enslaved people. The best example of this, I use this a great deal in workshops, is the 1774 manumission document to free his enslaved people, written by Caleb Green, excuse me, and witnessed by his fellow Quaker Moses Brown. Caleb Green did, quote, absolutely release, manumit, and discharge forever the 1/4 part of a man named Peter and the 1/2 part of a man named Venture, of whom the other half is claimed by another man. Oh, and Peter, of whom 2 other men claim the other 3/4. And he essentially ends by, he has seen the divine light. He's a committed Quaker. So he's freeing those parts of these men that he owns. And then he essentially ends with something like, so have a nice day. And of course, the question is, who's free here? Those men are now entirely owned by the remaining owners. There is one person here who is free. That's Caleb Green. He's free of sin. And many of these documents are focused on white men freeing themselves from sin. Now, of course, for enslaved people of color, the issue is not white people's sin, it's the anguish of being enslaved. Here's a quote from a 1773 petition to the Governor and Council of Massachusetts. Quote, let their behavior be what it will, neither they nor their children to all generations shall ever be able to do or to possess and enjoy anything, no, not even life itself, but in a manner as the beasts that perish, said one petition. When white political leaders proposed the natural rights argument to decry the colony's enslavement by England, men of color petitioned in the same terms, used the same terms. Quote, we have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms, said one petition. They quickly grabbed this revolutionary freedom language and threw it back essentially in the faces of people enslaving them. And more people of color began petitioning and going to court and demanding freedom. Other circumstances also fostered the possibility of thinking about maybe ending slavery. Again, this is a very slow and resisted process. The necessity of arming slaves, and James Glickman will be talking more about this. In 1778, Rhode Island offered 120 pounds compensation to masters who would enlist their slaves. I never see it put quite this way, but think about that. That's essentially the state buying mercenaries. The state is buying them. Now, it's it's promising the 120 pounds. Many Rhode Islanders were aghast at this provision, and it was eliminated a few months later. But in the interim, there's the Rhode Island First and Second, and Dr. Glickman will be talking about that. Again, they were aghast at it. It's eliminated a few months later. The petitions to the legislature after the revolution are full of people demanding their 120 pounds. Where's my money? My enslaved person so-and-so went off, and where's my money? So I think we need to think about this as a troubling idea. I think most important economic factors made slavery less profitable. The revolution disrupted the provisioning trades to the West Indies. It disrupted all kinds of trade with England, certainly with Europe. It cut markets for products. So that made slavery a little less desirable in the moment, but there's still a lot of resistance. So around 1780, the New England states began to take steps to end slavery. In 1783, the Rhode Island Assembly passed a post nati, after birth in Latin, post nati emancipation bill. Children born after March 1st, 1784, to enslaved women would be free after serving the owners of their mothers for 18 years if a girl and 21 years if a boy. Connecticut passed a similar bill right at the same time, and it went into effect the same time, freeing children of enslaved women, male and female, at 25. So you may ask yourself, what changed on March 1st, 1784? Nothing changed for existing enslaved people. Rhode Island reported nearly 1,000 slaves in the 1790 census. You will remember from the graph I showed you. Rhode Island reported 384 enslaved people in 1800. Rhode Island reported 5 enslaved people in 1840. Now that is long after Mr. Garrison has launched an immediatist plan to end slavery in the South. And here there were slaves next door. So when did slavery finally end in Rhode Island? Final abolition arrived with the 1842 Constitution. Article 1, Section 4 said bluntly, slavery will not be permitted in this state. Now think about that, 1842. Elsewhere in the North, there are a variety of post-nati gradual acts, judicial decisions concerning freedom suits on behalf of enslaved people. New Hampshire apparently ended slavery in an 1857 Citizenship Act. That's almost the eve of the Civil War. And although it isn't New England and not part of this, I have to mention New Jersey. New Jersey passed a gradual act in 1804 and abolished slavery absolutely in 1846 and created a new category. The new category was perpetual apprenticeship. We have no slaves, but we have perpetual apprentices. And the last perpetual apprentices were freed by the 13th Amendment. That's the North, right? So I'm pretty sure that's not what many of you learned in your history books. Now, what does that have to do with race and racism, you say, which is really the burden of my argument here? First of all, the gradualness of emancipation here, the fact that for a very long time, a white person could encounter a person of color and imagine that person was enslaved. That person could be enslaved. Unlike at the end of the after the 13th Amendment, whether white Southerners liked it or not, every person of color they encountered, they knew to be free. That wasn't the case here for a very long time. Why is that important? That allowed a mapping of language and practices and ideas developed in slavery, a mapping of that onto a growing population of free people of color. Meanwhile, the New England states immediately began to call themselves the Free States. Remember, at the 1787 Constitutional Convention, Madison tells us the problem was between the free states and the slave states. The free state of Rhode Island at that time had 1,000 slaves. The free state of Connecticut had almost 3,000. So, but we're the free states, and very quickly, whites in New England constructed an amnesia about the history of slavery that to a great extent erased the history of slavery, never really fully acknowledged it, allowed for the condition of disadvantage. Think about that. If there isn't an active memory and history, a story about slavery, then when white people looked at people of color who were disproportionately poor, disproportionately illiterate, disproportionately living in marginalized communities, what's the explanation? Well, it's not that a history of slavery, because we didn't really have that, right? It's their innate inferiority. It must be their innate inferiority. So I would argue that the mapping and the amnesia together constructed race as an innate, permanent, and heritable hierarchy of difference: white supremacy and Black inferiority. Now, all of this is about the construction of ideas that among whites, right? That is not to say free people of color sat there and let any of this happen. Free people of color adopted a huge host of strategies to enact their freedom and advance their economic, their prosperity, their place here. They founded their own churches, schools, temperance societies, newspapers. The first anti-slavery newspaper is not free. Is not the Liberator, Garrison's paper in 1831. It's Freedom's Journal, a Black newspaper, in 1827. They held a series of national conventions to debate what to do, both about their own condition here and what they called prejudice. The word racism wasn't used yet, but that's what they're talking about. What to do about that on the one hand, and what to do about their brethren in the South who were still enslaved. But there was great resistance among whites to Black freedom. And I would argue that racism became the management device that replaced slavery as a means of controlling people of color. White people in this moment began ever more to see Black freedom, but Black people, as a problem. They offered several different responses. One of them is ridicule. Here on the left is a broadside. It is a ventriloquistic broadside. That is to say, it pretends to be replicating the speech of people of color, but it's making fun of, it's lampooning what they're making up as the broken speech of free people of color. There are tons of these, and they're made by white people, making fun of essentially Black citizenship. You will notice that these are people of color cavorting, what looks to be a tavern. The man on the floor is drunk, throwing up. There's a bottle dripping. The woman, a lot of sexual imagery here. The woman in the elaborate hat and boa has two men's arms around her. The notion there being that Black women are promiscuous. These are everywhere. A Black man named Hosea Easton in 1837 writes a very interesting essay about how white people 1837, are training their children to be racists. He uses the term prejudice. And he talks about these. These are placards that are up everywhere. They're sold and pinned up. And this is, by the way, the language in here that is false Black English is we refer to as I dialect, EYE, because it's dialect that isn't substantially real. It's dialect only for the I. An example of that is if you say represent somebody as saying he was coming, and you spell it W-U-S, W-U-Z, you're not representing a different pronunciation. You're trying to make the person look ignorant. And that's how these broadsides were made. And the other response, beside ridicule, was violence. Essentially, these are efforts at removal, okay, of various sorts. People of color began to be warned out of Rhode Island towns and cities as having no legal settlement. People who often had lived there for 10 or more years, or had fled their enslavement to a town, but were not legally settled there. Suddenly, there's an upsurge around 1800 of warning people out of town. There were, in the entire North, 144 attacks on communities of color by white mobs, trying to drive them out, move them away in the antebellum period. 2 of them are in Providence. You may have heard of the broadside on the right references the hardscrabble riot in Providence in 1824. Hardscrabble is a particular community of people of color, sort of right across the river from where University Heights is. There's a second riot against people of color living in a section of Providence called Snowtown in 1831. And that's essentially under part of the State House lawn and its environs. Very ironically, given the things that we're talking about these days with respect to the protest actions and police violence, it was the actions in 1831 of the white mob against the Black community that led Providence to obtain a charter as a city with the express purpose of setting up a permanent police force. Now, they are not imagining, because we need one to protect Black people, they are imagining that we need one to quell the disturbances Black people cause, okay? But nonetheless, that's to some extent a certain irony. All kinds of ways of removing, revisioning the white republic, the imagined white republic of New England. The American Colonization Society, formed in 1816 to persuade free people of color to go back to Africa. Back. Now you understand, people of color in Rhode Island and New England, most of them, their parents were born here, their grandparents were born here, back to Africa. And Colonization Society sermons, many of these people are clergymen, insisted that African Americans were irredeemably degraded and that therefore the white prejudice against them was inevitable, essentially their fault, implication. ACS was very popular among the best people, elite whites in New England. There were incidents of digging up Black bodies for use in anatomy classes. All of these removal strategies, as I say, were attempts to revision an imagined white New England. Now, meanwhile, as the role of the slave trade and slavery here the role was being forgotten and racism and violence against people of color rose in Rhode Island and elsewhere in New England, what was Rhode Island doing? Rhode Island had begun its next phase, its rise as an industrial power. And this rise, too, was a rise on the backs of enslaved people of color, except this time it's African Americans enslaved in the American South. Here we have a familiar sight, no doubt, Slater Mill, birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution. Moses Brown, the Quaker who had fought, one of the Quakers, but the most visible and important, I think, Quaker who had fought to end slavery here, had little problem with processing cotton grown by enslaved people somewhere else. By 1850, Rhode Island was processing about, think of it, 284 million pounds of cotton annually, grown and picked cotton ball, B-O-L-L, by cotton ball, by over 3 million slaves, and by the eve of the Civil War, 4 million in the southern states. But Rhode Island was also the leader in producing Negro cloth, the cloth sold to southern planters to clothe their slaves. It's a woolen cloth on either a cotton or sometimes a linen weft. Warp, but the weft is woolen. This is one of the hazard mills, the hazards of South Kingstown, were the leaders in this manufacture. In 1850, 79% of Rhode Island's woolen production was Negro cloth. 7 million yards made in 33 mills. In case you're interested in what that looks like, those are samples from the Harvard Library. They have actual pieces of the fabric. All of the hazard records are at Harvard, and the male hazard records are at Harvard. And those are examples of Negro cloth samples. Some people are in the South are sending a piece and saying, can you make this? Can you make this? One of the ways to attempt to appease your enslaved people, you're not going to free them and you're going to work them to death, but some of them like yellow. So we'll pacify them with clothing that looks like this. There was a cotton or woolen mill, one or the other, at every fall of water in New England. And there are many falls of water, and in Rhode Island as well. This, for example, is a picture of its Exeter up here. I forget, you can't see my hand. Trust me, I'm pointing at the part at the top. But there's Shannock Mills, Carolina Mills, Rockville, Centerville, Moscow, Arcadia, Woodville. Those are all little mills, either processing, most of them, at least some of what they're processing is either cotton grown in the South or woolen cloth destined for the Southern market. The influence of the mills and mill owners on the culture and landscape of Rhode Island, think about that, was profound and lasting. Think about South Kingstown, all of that stone, all the stone stuff. The town hall was designed and built by a hazard. The neighborhood guild, all of those buildings are all related to hazard industry. Now they made woolen goods for other purposes as well, but still, in many of our communities down here, some of the most beautiful colonial and then federal houses were at some time or other owned by either people who employed enslaved people or later people associated with the mills. And why is that relevant to this race question? Well, so now there's a rising hostility against Black freedom, and the fact of this Southern production of materials and market for materials reinforced ideas about the necessity and the naturalness of Black inferiority and Black labor somewhere else, but inferiority here as well. But of course, the textile mills themselves employed mostly immigrant and native-born white labor, very rarely, occasionally, people of color. The naturalness of Black people here living on the margins was reinforced in that way as well. And I would argue that, I'm closing now, honest. I would argue that whites' resistance to a free and equal Black presence, their impulse to see people of color as movable and removable, okay, in New England and in the United States in general, but particularly in New England, has continued in one form or another ever since. Through the Reconstruction era, with the Ku Klux Klan more in the South, post-Reconstruction era, the rise of lynching and Jim Crow. But what about here in the 20th century with redlining? These are areas of the city of Providence that Black people can't get mortgages in. I think that one's in the 30s. That's 1933, I think. But redlining, keeping Black people out of neighborhoods. Urban renewal, the notion that people of color are living in places that are undesirable, and we will knock those places down and put better places there and remove the people who are there, have created neighborhoods there, have created communities there. And some of you will not maybe like the idea of this, but think about preservation and historic restoration. That's part of Benefit Street. Now, Benefit Street before Mrs. Chase and the restoration was largely occupied by families of color. When it was decided that suddenly, or recognized that, my God, these are historic houses, they're beautiful, those people were essentially removed. Those houses became restored. I'm a Brown University person. I love Benefit Street, but at whose expense? At whose expense did this restoration and preservation take place? And that's true in other communities in this state and elsewhere in New England as well. Black people are just seen as movable and removable still. This continues today in other ways. Persistent unequal access to resources, unequal healthcare, way over arrest and adjudication, way excessive conviction and imprisonment, and of course, being subjected to police violence, the immediate cause of widespread protests today. So in closing, I just want to say that these forms of structural racism are legacies. They're the newest phase, I think, of a white supremacy born with the colonization of the Americas and the enslavement of people of color there. Racism is a shapeshifter. It isn't the same. It doesn't manifest itself in the same way from generation to generation. We fix one aspect and it seems to reemerge, and it seems to reemerge because the tenets of it remain unrepaired, unrecognized. They're unacknowledged, and perhaps these protests today will have some role in creating an acknowledgement of them. At every point in this story, people of color themselves have reasoned, they've organized, they've protested, they've marched, they've taken their grievances to court, as they're doing today. And I think that we need very much to be participants in this struggle. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. And thank you for drawing the lines to make this relevant today, and this powerful image. I'd like to now invite questions. You can, I mentioned this in the beginning, but I'll go over it again. You can enter questions into chat. So if you're using a desktop, down in your row on the bottom of commands, you have chat right in the middle. And if you click on that, you can just type in and hit send, and I will read them out. Or if you're on an iPad, you just tap on the screen and bring up your command bar, and then you click on participants and scroll to the bottom of the list, and you'll be able to chat that way. We have about 40 participants. So if I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, if you're very familiar with Zoom and you know how to raise your hand, you can go ahead and do that and ask your question. You can unmute and turn on your camera and ask your question that way. If you're familiar with Zoom, go ahead and do that. I see Grace Farrell has her hand raised. So Grace, would you like to go ahead?
I have two questions, or comment questions. One is that it seems to me there is this basic contradiction in the um, origins of the country, in which all men, of course it was only men and it was only white property owning men, were created equal. But there, that is like the motto of the country. It is the myth of the country. All men are created equal. And I think that one of the ways of smoothing over that contradiction was to seriously question the humanity of African slaves. I can't give you quotes directly at this moment, but I've seen them in my own reading during this time period. And in the 19th century, with the abolitionist movement, there's so many broadsides that show shackled men or women saying, "Ain't I a man? Ain't I a woman?" Because it was a question. It was not accepted that the slaves were fully human.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, I'm asking you for your input on that.
I think that, I mean, the question of property in human beings has always been um, a, a legal fiction. I think that the treatment of enslaved people definitely often that the feeling that white men were entitled to treat African descended people any way they wanted to is a dehumanizing thing. On the other hand, it is also the case. I think that the problem with being enslaved is that you are enslaved people raised white people's children, took care of their children. Some of them were responsible for very complicated jobs. There is no way that they were not recognized as human in that sense. They were recognized, I would argue, as a variety of human being that has none of the entitlements of white humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But no one actually thought that they were having their child taken care of, their baby taken care of day after day by someone who was not human. I mean, I think the contradiction is that manifests sometimes in the notion of a double creation, where Black people were somehow created apart from the I don't know, Adam and Eve, you know, in the garden kind of thing, that they're created differently, but that the idea that they are human beings, but they're human beings who are not entitled to any of the rights and respect that, and they're a kind of human being apart. And the trouble for enslaved people is the more you were like your master, the angrier that made him in some respects. And the less you were like your master, the less useful you were, and that made him angry. You had to be absolutely like white people and nothing like white people. Every minute, one thing or the other, one or the other. There's no place to stand and be an enslaved person. But I think it's also the case that now, I mean, it's dehumanizing the way in which white people have treated people of color, but it's not successful in the sense that even in white minds that these are not people, because they fulfill in slavery a whole set of obligations that you need to be a human being to fulfill. So it's a contradiction internally with respect to white slaveholders. And nowadays, I would argue the way poor Mr. Floyd was killed by that policeman seems to me to reflect a degree of hatred that human beings only hate other human beings. They resent them for their humanity, but they
Yeah,
hate them as human beings. You
that's
don't hate your poodle. You hate people who are people, and the very peopleness of them makes you angry. See,
because
I think that's where
because
the
of that contradiction right at the beginning.
yeah.
The other remark I wanted to make was the slave cloth. There's a wonderful piece in Frederick Douglass's his first autobiography, because that slave cloth, that linen, was flax, and for the most part, it was quite unprocessed. So it had little prickles sticking out of it,
Well,
and
it's flax. That's the warp sometimes.
yeah,
The weft is wool. And why in the world would you clothe people in Alabama or Tennessee in wool? Because it lasts like forever.
it does.
But it's uncomfortable and horrible. Yeah, you're
Well,
absolutely
the flax in particular had all sorts of, pokes and whatever, and he describes it. His when he got a new one, once a year, his back would just be as if he had been whipped. But he had a kindly older brother who would wear it in for him,
yeah.
and he would get it. So it was a cruelty right in the material structure of this slave cloth.
Mm.
But people can always find a rationale for what they do, especially if it brings in money.
We've got some other great questions here I'm going to read out. Renee Boyce said, great information. Why is there a lack of discussion on slavery and its effects in the North today, despite the information known?
Well, a few years ago, it's probably 10 years now, I'm at the point where I say something happened 3 years ago and it was really 12, so some time ago, a whole group of us, actually right around the time that Katrina was making Traces of the Trade, there was a strong effort to get the public schools to introduce very explicitly Rhode Island slavery into the curriculum. And I think, and some teachers do that to some extent independently now, but it coincided to some extent, that moment, with the No Child Left Behind moment, the Teach to the Test moment, which subsequently became, I forget what you call it, but it's kind of the same thing, the testing craze. And it made, I think, history in general, and this history in particular, something that there was no time for. I know teachers in the Providence school system. I've given courses to teachers and had some Rhode Island teachers in those NEH workshops and institutes whom I know are putting some of this into their curricula. I would like to see, but carefully. I mean, its counterpart needs to be an emphasis on how African Americans fought for their own freedom and humanity and advancement and achievement all the way along. My story is a story about how we get here from the perspective of how the modern racism is a legacy of a whole set of things. But there needs to be these two pieces of kinds of information in the curriculum. How African American people have succeeded in all kinds of ways, including in slavery. I mean, Keith Stokes talks about a lot of Newport enslaved people were artisans and achievers of various sorts. So there need to be some curriculum units that do both of those things. I think we don't find it. It's not a priority because, for one reason, it's difficult stuff to teach, especially at lower grade levels. The lampooning broadsides I showed you, ridicule is a terrible thing. Kids in school know ridicule is a terrible thing, but you can't use those broadsides with, I mean, maybe juniors and seniors, but you can't, the materials are painful. So I don't know, I would love to see this happen. I keep waiting for it to happen.
Okay, I have a question, or Daniel Ruth said, thank you for this fantastic talk. I'm wondering if you could please elaborate upon the role that gender played in the history of gradual emancipation in Rhode Island and in New England more broadly. For instance, you mentioned the respective ages outlined in the gradual emancipation laws passed in Rhode Island and Connecticut in 1784. How did they determine these ages? And in the course of your research, how did gender determine one's chances of becoming emancipated?
Okay, that's a long, complicated question. In Connecticut, the gradual emancipation law says 25, male or female. But Rhode Island, 18 if a girl, 21 if a boy. Those are the same ages at which indenture ends as well, of black, Indian, and white people. The idea that freedom, just the notion of adulthood as being an earlier phenomenon for women than for men is a very old idea. In many places, for a very long time, women could be married at an earlier age than men. I mean, that's a long-standing thing. As far as how it worked out, for one thing, one of the ways a lot of people became free is by running away. And running away is a lot easier for men than it is for women who might have small children. So if you look at fugitive slave notices from Rhode Island and elsewhere in New England, there are far more men, boys and men running away than girls and women. Women have children at an earlier age than, an 18-year-old woman may very well in this time period have one or two children and can't run. So that's number one. Number two, women, there are a lot of wills in which the slave owner says, I free my faithful enslaved person so-and-so, they say my faithful slave, after she serves my widow, my wife, for 5 years or 10 years. Those are very often, as many men as women show up in those. The argument can be that that's ultimately freedom. The opposing argument would be it's a way of making sure people don't run away, because you're gonna get your freedom at some point, and so you're gonna be an obedient enslaved person until that time. But women and men show up in the same way there. I think there's an old mythology that in agricultural slavery that women are in the household and men are in the garden and in the fields, and that's just not true. During any moment of sowing or reaping or winnowing or all of those moments, women are sent out into the fields along with men. Some women are men and women, I have not noticed very much of a difference in likelihood of being emancipated. And again, with the Gradual Act, women become emancipated sooner than men do. I mean, a lot of this is also colored by the degree to which there are gender balances, at what point there are more men than women enslaved and then more women than men, remain enslaved or not. It's kind of a complicated question. Gender matters, but I hope, I mean, too many of the movies we've seen lately and dealing with Southern slavery have women, especially in Louisiana, but women emancipated to be mistresses. And I don't see that in this time period here. Women are emancipated. There are emancipations because enslavers like Green suddenly feel the weight of sin. There are emancipators who emancipate by reward. If you rescue somebody's daughter who falls down a well, you may get rewarded. There are more men than women who make contracts with their owners to work outside and essentially buy their freedom. And that's because there are more opportunities to do that if you're male than if you're female. And of course, those are sometimes honored and sometimes not. Venture Smith in Connecticut is a classic example of an enslaved person who, the first time he makes a deal and then turns over the money, he doesn't, his owner says essentially, just kidding, and kept the money, and then later on he's freed. I don't see a strong pattern. And I think once people of color are freed, you saw that cartoon, women are represented as promiscuous often, men are represented as violent and dangerous, and both are sexualized in ways that are very, very destructive and very long lasting. I think I've had a lot of students, I always, at the end of my classes on slavery, I would get a disproportionate, for the school, for University of Kentucky, where I taught for a long time, a disproportionate number of kids of color in my class because they're interested in the subject. And by the end of the course, we would talk about things that had happened to them. And I don't think I've ever had a male African descended student, whether African American or Caribbean, who hadn't had the experience of standing in an elevator and the door opens and a middle class white lady is there wanting to go up and suddenly looks in the elevator at him and decides she doesn't really need to use the elevator. I mean, all of them have had these experiences. More men than women have been pulled over by police, but women have been brutalized as well. So I'm going on about this, but it's complicated. It's a very interesting question. I'll stop.
Well, so the next question by Paul Scheinkoff was, how pervasive was Jim Crow in Rhode Island?
Well, I mean, first of all, the phrase Jim Crow comes out of minstrelsy, and New England had minstrel shows in the 1840s, lots of them. But there was a great deal of, during this whole time period that we're talking about, in the period after most people of color are in fact free people of color here, all forms of transportation are segregated here. It isn't called Jim Crow, but they're segregated. Prudence Crandall's school gets pillaged, sort of, because a white woman in Connecticut, decided to enroll an African-American young woman. And then when all the white families withdrew their kids, she decided, okay, she's a white Quaker. Okay, I will run a school for African-American young women who come in from other states, and that she's jailed for introducing foreign, not our Negroes, people of color from somewhere else. So schools are, in some places, schools are integrated because they're very small communities, but in any city, There's a struggle in the 1840s to desegregate the Boston schools. They're segregated. So there are conventions. A few of them are laws, but most of them are conventions that we don't have. We don't fund schools for the same school for both races. We have a public school for black kids and a public school for white kids. Companies, transportation companies, make the decision that no, black men, like Frederick Douglass is a famous example, cannot sit in the same car of a railroad with whites. Steamships travel is segregated. So I wouldn't call them Jim Crow laws, because the Jim Crow idea is later and Southern, but the fact of it, the same kind of experience is widespread in New England. It's very widespread in New England. And it's de facto segregation, and de facto segregation was very widespread in Rhode Island and elsewhere. There's no lynching here. Interestingly, somebody once asked me, well, this brochure I was writing that was about New England's slavery, well, why weren't there people lynched? Well, people were accused falsely of slave revolts and killed in horrible ways, but there isn't any lynching when there's slavery, because people are valuable property. And there are other ways of racism managing populations of color at least in most of New England. There are a couple of lynchings in the North, but they're around 1900, 1910. 1910 is the peak of lynching, but they're in the Midwest. Anyway.
Okay, and then Lily Bell said, thank you for the lecture. I'm curious about the aside you mentioned, that Bristol became the center of slave trade after the Revolution. Could you explain why this was?
Well, I can explain why Newport isn't. Newport comes back after the Revolution, but remember, Newport is occupied by the British. So the New England, the Rhode Island slave trade that was operating happily out of Newport, happily from its point of view, gets disconnected during the Revolution, and afterward there's a great kind of disorder in Newport that allows Bristol to gain ascendancy over the trade. Also, Bristol manages to get a separate customs, what do you call it? Customs, not depot, not center, but the person who is in charge of seeing whether the boats go in and out and taxing them, arranging taxes for them, gets a district, a separate customs district in Bristol, and one of DeWolf's cousin, maybe he's related to DeWolf in some way, gets appointed the customs agent. So it becomes easier and more profitable to do slaving voyages out of Bristol. Newport recovers to some extent, but it never becomes the principal slave port that it is before the Revolution. The Revolution is hard on Newport.
Okay, and then I missed an earlier question, or it was Sarah Holmes said, thanks for a great lecture. She said, have you come across any interesting Rhode Island novelists or poets who discuss slavery in their work? And I'm just going to jump in and say that James Glickman, who is speaking on the 25th at 6 p.m., his book, Crossing Point is historical fiction. It's about the first Black and Native American regiment from Rhode Island. That is historical fiction. But Joanne, do you have any recommendations?
I'm trying to think whether the writer, there's a book called, that's a young adult book, but it's great, called Spider in the Tree or Spider in a Tree. And it is about Jonathan Edwards. And so it's not about Rhode Island, but I think the author may be Rhode Island or she may be Massachusetts, I'm not sure, but it's very close to here. But it's a wonderful book. Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God, lives in Northampton, Massachusetts, comes to Newport to buy a slave, and her name is Venus. And on his way home, he quickly renames her Leah, takes away a Venus, and names her, gives her a biblical name. And Spider in a Tree is about Leah's experience of enslavement. It's fiction, but it's her experience and her experience with Jonathan Edwards. And that's she may be, I can't remember, and I can't think of her name right now. I could get up and go to my shelves and haul it in, but that's a very good northern fiction. Oh, and there's all Toni Morrison's last book, I think, was her last very short piece of fiction, I think, was about something had to do with northern slavery. I read it, but I read it a while ago. But again, she's not a Rhode Island author. I don't know of a very clearly Rhode Island author writing about New England slavery, writing fiction about it. But Spider in a Tree is a great thing to assign to high school kids because it's short and readable and really gives you a sense of the feeling of northern slavery, which is really very different in a lot of ways. It's not milder, that myth of mild slavery. It's not better, but the environment is different, and it's earlier than most of the fiction that's antebellum Southern slavery. It's colonial. The environment is colonial New England, and that's a really good book.
Any other questions out there? I don't have any more in chat. Joanne, I just want to say for your first Zoom lecture, you get an A+.
Oh, thank you.
Really, you handled the technology very well. I know you were.
The thing I couldn't do is stop pointing at stuff on my screen, which of course you can't see me do. And I'm pointing away, and I couldn't restrain that. I've got to learn better how to. I should have had a pointer and been actually pointing at my screen. I think you could have seen the light move. Is that right? On my slides.
Oh, maybe.
I mean, I don't know.
No,
but anyway,
I'm not sure. There's probably a way to do that, but I'm not exactly sure.
Anyway, thank you very much. I have enjoyed this, and I'm so pleased that it worked. Thank you.
Yes, worked very well. And I just want to end. We, in the discussions we've been having, we've talked a bit about how confronting our local history of slavery is just a first small step. And, and you brought up, Joanne, what might be a next step, which is trying to get this into our local curriculum. And Ana Flores has reached out to our local Charahoe school to try to talk to them about including some of this history in the curriculum there. Ana, I see you've unmuted. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I've been in touch there, and they're waiting for a new superintendent, but they very much want to continue being involved with us and trying to use this. So yeah, we're going to stay on it. We're going to stay on it. It's essential in this area that history is addressed. I mean, they're walking that land every day, and they should know where they are and what went on here and what that means. Yeah.
Can I tell a quick anecdote?
Yeah.
Just
Please.
really quick. So I'm teaching in Kentucky, my African American history class, and I have a kid in my class named Matt Stanton. Now, this is Lexington, Kentucky, and there are lots of people named Stanton. But I use some of the primary documents I use in teaching. One of them happens to be something about, I forget Stanton, but uh, and 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 of course, one of the Stantons is a translator for the Narragansett for a very long time. There are still native speaking Narragansett as late as the 1750s. So anyway, I'm going along, and afterward, Matt comes up to me and says, that's my ancestor, and we know all about General Stanton and my father is so proud of his whole family, but we never knew that they were slave owners.
Mm.
And so it was very interesting. He went off to Thanksgiving up in Kentucky and came back and had talked to his parents about it. And happily enough, they weren't, I mean, they could have rejected this out of hand as being a bad thing, but they were very interested, and I had a couple of documents and stuff. But isn't that funny? I mean, Matt Stanton, who knew? And
Joanne, can you hear me?
yes,
It's Pam. I wanted to just interject a thought for you or some information. There's a lot of confusion about that family because there were 4 Joseph Stantons. The 5th one was a nephew who actually owned that inn in the late 1700s. But General Joseph Stanton himself was the son of a slave owner, Joseph Stanton III, and he was the one they refer to as holding the most slaves in Rhode Island. General Joseph Stanton was our first U.S. Senator to Rhode Island and actually helped to form the Providence Abolitionist Society with Moses Brown. So in all due fairness, it's good for people to understand that General Joseph Stanton, who by the way was born in what is now called the Wilcox Tavern, was an abolitionist and did great things.
well, I can't remember. I mean, this is years ago, but at the time, the person whose reference I used was the right person in the family tree that his parents had proudly put together. And
Exactly. Yes.
he said never in his life had he encountered in college anything remotely related to him.
Right. But it's very frightening to see that his father was the largest slave owner in the state of Rhode Island. So it's such an incredible comparison, or you know, a differentiation of the father and son. But just goes to show you, you know, about the human spirit and compassion and what's right and wrong. So he rose to the occasion for sure.
Indeed, that's a wonderful story. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Charlotte Carrington Farmer added to the chat that she's working with the Rhode Island Historical Society on curriculum on slavery in Rhode Island. Lesson plans and resources will be available online.
Great.
So that will be wonderful. And then we had a couple of book suggestions in the chat. Black Woman, a fictionalized biography of Lucy Terry Prince by Bernard Katz. And an interesting read on one of New England's most eminent enslaved women. And Gretchen Holbrook Gerzina's Mr. and Mrs. Prince is an excellent biography of Prince.
I have one more book to add. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, and I can't remember the author, but the book was called Never Caught. And it was about George and Martha Washington's young slave. A true story, and it was incredible.
He ends up, yes, that Never Caught. What is that writer's name?
Erica Dunbar, somebody just put in the chat.
The slave question ends up in Portland, is that right?
He ends up in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire, yeah, but Portsmouth. Ends up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That's right. And that's a very interesting book. That's a great book.
It was 50 years after Washington was dead. She felt she was safe, so she allowed the newspaper to interview her about her life as a slave for the Washingtons. Yeah, it's an incredible book.
Yeah. And then someone else added to the chat, Christian McBurney, who Joanne cited, is a Rhode Island native. Not sure if he wrote about slavery, but that was suggested as maybe.
he wrote an undergraduate honors thesis that in smaller schools would have passed as a PhD dissertation. And it was about, the title was The Rise and Fall of the Narragansett Planters.
Oh, yeah.
And then he pulled an article out of it that got published in Rhode Island History. He also, there's a former enslaved man down here named Cato Pierce, whose narrative he did an edited edition of, and that was published as well. So yeah, he did a lot of stuff about slavery.
Oh.
And I don't have any more questions in the chat. I did put together a reading, watching list of books and films on slavery in New England, which I will share with everyone who I sent, which is everyone who got the link to tonight's event. And there's also a list. Another small step, there's a list of read, watch list on racism. So I will send that out to everyone.
Can I ask you, do you have on that list the movie 12 Years a Slave? I was so irritated when I went to see that movie that no one had pointed out. His name is Northup. Now, nowhere else in the United States in that time period is anyone spelled not Northrop, but Northup. Northup's Garage down here in South Carolina. The Northups, he is the 12 Years a Slave. Solomon Northup is enslaved. He's not enslaved, he's a free man, but his parents were enslaved in Rhode Island by Northups. And then the family moved to New York, and he's in New York when he gets captured. And those Northups, the white Northups, are part of the people, that white guy you see near the end of the movie is a white Northup who participates in getting him saved, essentially, because he knows he's free. But that's a big Rhode Island connection. If I were running a movie house in Rhode Island, I would have had a big sign saying, this is a Rhode Island story. I mean, Northup, where do you see Northup? And it gets misspelled by scholars all the time who insist that it must really be Northrop, and it is not. Anyway, people should look at that movie with new eyes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joanne.
Thank you very much for having me. I've loved it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And there were a few questions I forgot to address about the recording of this event, and it will take me a couple of days, but I will get that link up on our website for people, and I will send that link out with the book list, so you will all be receiving that.
Thank you, Sarah.
And there are lots of thank yous coming in the chat. I don't know if you can see that, Joanne, but
thank you. This was fun. I was kind of scared to death of doing it at the beginning, and I can do this. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not the same as having standing room only in our programming room, but you know what? It's better than doing nothing. So I've really appreciated having these Zoom events during all of this. So, all right. So I think with that, I'm going to end our event tonight, and I actually added everyone who attended this event to the list for James Glickman's event. So you'll be receiving the link to that one as well. And I do hope to see you there.
Thank you, Sarah.
And thanks again, Joanne. Yes, and Pam, thank you. All right.
Good night. Take care.
Good night. Take care.